This is the McAllen and Lower Rio Grande battle video. To introduce this video, we go to the larger map, where within Mexico, you have the major invasion prongs of the external forces. In the Lower Rio Grande Valley, which will be covered in this video, you have group armies 15 through 20 advancing up through that area. Further north, you have group armies 7 through 13 advancing right up the middle of the country. In this invasion prong here, you have group armies 1 through 6, along with the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, advancing up to Amarillo before breaking off in different directions to aid local Trojan shock forces. And the westernmost prong of invasion, you have the 14th PLA Group Army along with the PAP 18th Armored Brigade, assisting the local Trojan shock force of the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division before heading north through Albuquerque, passing the local Trojan forces securing the area of the 3rd Iranian Armored Brigade and 18th Pakistani Infantry Division, before reaching Santa Fe, northern New Mexico, and lower Colorado, which is the AO of the 8th Russian Combined Arms Army, before these forces break off to aid local Trojans in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Throughout the map, there are many Trojan shock forces consisting of the 44th Pozdaran Brigade, which is an IRGC brigade. We have the PAP in their multiple brigades, and also a division and regiment of them at the border, which will be explored in one of the upcoming battles, the Battle of Dolores West and Penitas Ranches, and also additional PAP units, such as the 7th PAP Brigade, a Trojan unit, the 15th PAP Brigade, 43rd PAP Brigade, 10th PAP Armored Brigade, and the 6th PAP Armored Brigade. There's also the 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade and the 612th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, as well as the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade as a Trojan unit already inside the country. As mentioned in the last video, these forces came from the Eastern Theater Command in China. And off the coast, you have the 1st and 6th Marine Brigades within various cargo ships in disguise, along with their helicopter carriers, the Type 075 helicopter carriers, which carry their air assault assets, their aviation assets, their armed reconnaissance attack helicopters, basically, their transport helicopters for their air assault battalions, as well as their LCACs for landing their recon battalions, which are light forces. Each Marine Brigade has 1 recon battalion each, 1 air assault battalion each, 3 regular combined arms battalions, which are heavier units, and an artillery and air defense battalion, as well as 2 different support battalions, as mentioned in the last video. The 1st is tasked with landing locally here within the Houston/Texas City/Galveston area to capture the port facilities intact, along with Port Arthur being captured by the 6th Marine Brigade, respectively. Within the South Central sector, 238,000 total American defenders faced off against the 1,648,000 strong total Sino-Russian coalition forces in the area. These defenders, which faced off against them, consisted of 180,000 total military defenders, of the American Armed Forces, along with 58,000 armed civilians who emerged to make an attempt at fighting back against the vicious onslaught of the invasion. Counted among the civilian numbers is also the non-military, albeit paramilitary, security forces for the sake of simplicity. Within the Rio Grande Valley, defenders were the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade and its subunits comprising it of the National Guard, also smaller companies operating in an independent capacity in regards to the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, which consisted of the 961st Quartermaster Company and 461st Transportation Detachment, which was a company itself, both being of the Army Reserve instead of the National Guard. In addition was the 111th Attack Squadron of the 141st or the 147th Attack Wing of the Texas Air National Guard. Border Patrol and Customs Enforcement paramilitary forces, and even armed militia-type forces in the area themselves formed in response to previous border crises. Also, unorganized reactionary armed civilian forces as well. All of the aforementioned forces combined constituted the only defenses within just this sector of the border region as a whole. Coming at them was a total force of 320,000 Chi-Com troops of Group Armies 15 through 20 of the easternmost invasion prong of the South Central invasion sector, with full air and missile support from land, sea, and air assets. Even as the anti-satellite weapons struck their targets, namely the tracked individual satellites of the American constellations of such overhead, along with the debilitating, virtually crippling cyber strike, Sino-Russian coalition forces were already breaking out of their CCP properties relating to the Trojan shock armies, going straight for the proverbial jugular. All of these different group armies and smaller units as well, like your paramilitary elements, breaking off of all their various CCP properties in these circled regions, coming together and preparing to go for their objectives in their AOs, or areas of operations, which they were responsible for. All as their external components raced across the border, beginning their mad dash deep inland to join them as their heavy-handed reinforcements. Their initial waves of forces crossing the Rio Grande, all as howitzer and rocket artillery of various sizes, along with scores of aircraft high overhead, drones of all types, and missiles as well, flew inland to decimate key anticipated points of resistance, command and control centers, and other key targets pre-planned ahead of the invasion. Moreover, it should be noted that the command and control targets had their capabilities highly curtailed from the tandem cyber/anti-sat strikes, and truly only had any real impact at the most local of levels, and that could only be said of such elements who even survived the opening pulverizing array of various strike means being employed against them. Of the three main prongs of advance moving through Texas, not counting the fourth prong primarily tasked with advancing through New Mexico State, the westernmost prong faced literally no resistance apart from a scant few ranchers taking pot shots at their vehicles, doing no damage whatsoever at all, but inviting upon themselves an overwhelming retaliation for such gestures of token resistance. All the while, in other areas of border penetration, the circumstances were a bit different. These entailing real combat, some of which produced actual casualties upon the invaders, though however light it was when looking at the sheer magnitude of the size of these invading armies. During the Battle of McAllen, Texas and surrounding area, there had actually been American forces arrayed in this zone, some of which being a result of prior border intrusions due to past failed immigration policies, while others were more recent, as an attempted so-called show of force type of gesture, as a response to tensions going on in the world. Although, while so doing, never came to fully understand that the enemies of their land wouldn't be sending over tiny raiding parties, but a full-scale, gigantic juggernaut of an invasion force numbering a grand total of 12.5 million strong, something never before seen in human history, being 3 times the total size of Operation Barbarossa, what had, since this moment, been the largest ever invasion in history until now. While it could certainly be said that over 12 different National Guard battalions, reinforced by some artillery systems, along with thousands of armed civilian militias or other groupings of such, could deter small, weak forces, such as rogue criminal elements south of the border or third world tin pot dictators who lacked any real military forces or power projection capabilities. It certainly measured nowhere near adequate enough to repel the #1 world superpower, which was China, along with the #2 being Russia, not to mention a host of smaller allies in tow with them. Smaller allies which, in many cases, were Tier 2 powers with large and/or capable enough forces that still could pose a major threat by themselves, much less combined into a coalition along with the world's premier 2 powers leading them. As the combat initiated along the border at the furthest eastern prong, in the McAllen, Texas area, salvos of 122mm and 300mm rocket artillery, along with 152 and 155mm howitzer shells, flew overhead of the troops conducting their river crossing operations, smashing into urban areas in the region, as well as military targets in the same area as well. There was one squad of 12 Su-25s assigned specifically to just the McAllen, Texas area that screamed overhead on their designated flight paths to safely hit their targets, all coordinated by combat air controllers and artificial intelligence systems, ensuring that with all of the various munitions and systems then in use, that there was no friendly fire accidents. Because adding to this was also that 2 different nations, Russia and China, were operating and coordinating activities within this and many multiple other sectors throughout the invasion, making coordination and planning and taking care thereof to ensure safety of the utmost importance. Despite having completely lost their communications and military networks, the 4th of the 133rd, a HIMARS battalion belonging to the Texas National Guard's 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, already did have their systems preset on certain points inside of Mexico, as a 12-pod MLRS, an M270, could demolish a grid square, which is a 1 by 1 kilometer area, a 6-pod HIMARS, half the amount, could use its same 270 millimeter rockets in half the number of pods to reliably destroy a 500 meter by 1 kilometer area, or about half of a grid square. These were the units in the area on the American side. This being the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade as a whole, in the parentheses, and these units were they that comprised it. The 4th of the 133rd, the HIMARS Battalion, the headquarters of Headquarters Company, a signals company attached to the 136th being the 625th Brigade Signals Company, as well as the 136th MP Brigade, or Battalion rather, and that was the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade. As for the smaller companies, they had set up a type of logistical / ISR makeshift installation within the Padre Island International Airport within Brownsville. Of the Chinese 16th Group Army, spearheading 5 other group armies within just this prong of the invasion, in addition to their group army, possessed 300 millimeter rocket artillery themselves. Although not their longest range A300 systems and associated 300 millimeter rockets, but they possessed the more common PHL-03 systems and their shorter range 300 millimeter rockets. These rockets, though, still had a very long range of some 80 miles, although not as long range as their A300, which was actually the longest range rocket artillery system in the world. Even so, many reserve group armies used older systems as opposed to active duty Chinese group armies who acquired the newest systems first before proliferating to the reserves. Not that these slightly older systems weren't still extremely effective and lethal and still cutting edge, but that as newer, better developments came along, reserves and paramilitary formations in China typically got the hand-me-down equipment with a few exceptions, like when a brand new item was produced quickly enough for some reserve units to also receive them in addition to the active units acquiring them first. That notwithstanding, at this particular battle, one advantage the Americans actually did possess over the Chinese invaders was that their HIMARS actually had a better range than the PHL-03 and was close in power rocket to rocket as the 300 millimeter rocket, and as it wasn't too much larger than the 270 millimeter rocket. Although the PHL-03 carried 2 times more rockets than did the HIMARS, and thus destroyed a far larger area in a single volley from a single system. Shorter range artillery, namely the howitzers and 122 millimeter rocket artillery, were used to hit the closest American targets before finally packing up to move inland. This to join the whole 16th Group Army on the march north, with 300 millimeter rockets and airstrikes used on the furthest targets in this battle. Closer in targets along the border included elements of American paramilitary formations tasked with the protection thereof of the border, in addition to both known and appearing clusters of armed civilians, according to both previous and developing intelligence on the area and changing battlefield conditions as they were occurring. Tasked with addressing these targets were the artillery battalions of the 16th Group Army's 19th Artillery Division, which was this unit right here, with the battalions belonging to it being all of these artillery battalions with the horizontal lines. With the 4th Armored Division's 1 Artillery Battalion, which was this right here. And this was the 4th Armored Division right here. This symbolized the 4th Armored, and these were all the battalions that comprised this unit in parentheses. All the units are in parentheses, with the battalions comprising them being their subunits that make them as a whole. And the 46th Mechanized Infantry Division's additional 1 artillery battalion. This is the 46th right here, arrayed along this part of the river. This symbolizes them, 46th. These are all their sub-battalions that make them up. The battalions with horizontal lines are artillery. The ones with vertical lines are air defense. Without any symbol is mechanized infantry. Circle is armored or tank battalions. And the AT means these are anti-tank battalions, which belong to the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade right here, these AT battalions. Battalions of the 19th Artillery Division were comprised of 2 PHL-81 battalions, which were the 122 millimeter rocket artillery systems, which were older and truck-based, being the PHL-81s, but they were still highly deadly weapons. 2 battalions of 300 millimeter rocket artillery of the PHL-03 systems, as mentioned earlier. 5 battalions of towed PLL-01 howitzers, which were 155 millimeter howitzers, and 5 battalions of PLL-66 towed 152 millimeter howitzers. Of the 4th Armored Division's Divisional Artillery Battalion, its batteries comprising it, which a battery is a company-sized unit, but in artillery or air defense units, they're called batteries. The batteries comprising it were made up of PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers, and with the 46th Mechanized Infantry's Divisional Artillery Battalion, it was comprised of PLZ-83 self-propelled howitzers. Among the other targets of the Chi-Com artillery was, of course, the HIMARS Battalion, as already noted, but also the 136th MP Battalion camped at the border camped out at border-adjacent combat outposts, comprised of earthworks topped with concertina wire, earlier constructed to enhance border security operations in recent years. Although the headquarters of Headquarters Company of the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade and Signals Company of the 625th Brigade, which was attached to the 136th Maneuver Enhancement Brigade, being just out of range of the Chinese 300mm rockets, instead fell prey to Russian Su-25 strikes. Su-25s. This is the entire squadron in groupings of 4 going for their specific targets to strike. This is the headquarters of Headquarters Company and the Signals Company, and they're just out of range of the Chi-Com 300mm rockets coming from back further away from the Rio on the Mexican side, miles back. They fell prey to Russian Su-25 strikes, finding their encampments being strafed by exploding 30mm cannon ammunition, as well as being hit by an array of short-range air-to-ground missiles and rockets, as well as both free-fall and laser-guided munitions. These initial strikes, causing panicked flight among these 2 individual American companies, leading them to flee further inland, albeit very slowly due to both a lack of remaining viable, usable vehicles, as many were destroyed, as well as in an organized manner, as by this point, without communications, without any intelligence, the troops were totally panicked and afraid and were scattered. Due to the relatively short distance and flight time required from bases in Mexico to this battle space and back, several sorties were flown by the Su-25 squadron within this 7-hour battle, allowing for many targets to be wiped out by their air-based assaults. Due to its relatively short range without drop tanks for carrying extra fuel, the Su-25 ended up being an ideal aircraft for the border region due to the short distances involved, as stated. While these strikes began, the armored vehicles of the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade, its combat elements being equipped with AFT-10 missile tracked vehicles which fired 8 HJ-10 long-range anti-tank missiles, which were very potent, very long range at 6.2 miles, over twice as long as an American TOW missile anti-tank system, and ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles, some of China's best tracked infantry fighting vehicles, carrying a 100mm cannon with a 30mm autocannon and a coax 7.62 by 54mm machine gun, all on the same vehicle turret. The 46th Mechanized Infantry Division's primarily Type 63 armor personnel carriers and ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles, and the 4th Armored Division's Type 88C main battle tanks, ZBD-04 IFVs, and Type 63 APCs, with all aforementioned units' headquarters elements sharing most of the same vehicle types of MRAPs and various support vehicles, seized the key bridges spanning the Rio Grande intact, along with river fording in some of the river's many shallow points. This, upon some of the heavy barrages shifting rearward to other areas as the troops advanced into enemy territory. So heavy was the shelling and rain of rockets that huge sections of McAllen and surrounding communities, being here and Mission, as well as others elsewhere like Far, were already smashed into rubbled ruins, requiring only a short 2-hour duration for troops of the 46th Mechanized Infantry Division to sweep the ruins for any resistance, ultimately finding very little to none apart from scattered, shocked survivors, many of whom made or could even make only a half-hearted attempt to fight back, as this area had been completely smashed to ruins by the various howitzer and rocket artillery, especially the 122mm rockets and the 152 and 155mm howitzers being fired from this artillery division right here, which all smashed this area to rubbled ruins. And when the 46th ID crossed these key bridges here and here, as well as the armor crossing here and fording rivers, as well as the AT Brigade crossing and fording, when the 46th went in, they surrounded large areas of the city and cleared them of what little resistance remained of these initial forces that were shelled to oblivion. These dashed lines, whether red or green, symbolizes the exchange of rocket or howitzer artillery, such as when the 4th of the 133rd fired into their pre-selected sites in Mexico. As they lost their GPS and their military networks, they could only fire manually and where they already had their rocket systems essentially trained on. With much of the actual force-on-force combat occurring now on the periphery of McAllen and Brownsville metro areas and not so much within them, with a few exceptions such as the Padre Island International Airport, which was right here, right across the river in Brownsville. while indeed there otherwise were decent numbers of armed civilians and paramilitary forces inside these cities, the pulverizing artillery reduced them to virtually nothing due to total surprise, thereby annihilating most where they stood in and outdoors. Clearing the left flank of the 16th Group Army was the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade and 16th Special Operations Battalion. There and right there, who went for groups of now emerging armed civilians to the west of McAllen, shaken from sleep by the thunderous cacophony of blasting now erupting nationwide, including merely a few miles from their locations, and soon to reach them as well. This, as recon drones spotted and relayed their coordinates to the FDCs, or fire direction controllers, of each respective artillery battery covering their area, while the heavily armed anti-tank specialty infantry troops and anti-tank vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles of the 5th Anti-Tank Brigade approached to finish off whatever the artillery miraculously didn't smash, while the companies of the Spec Ops Battalion went straight for the 136th MP Battalion, soon to be joined by a battalion of the Anti-Tank Brigade tasked out to assist in dealing with the 136th MP Battalion, though they weren't really needed at all, but sent for good measure. Of the Spec Ops Battalion, the headquarters company operated all of the battalion's Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles, which themselves were almost like miniaturized Humvees in some ways, when modular armor kits were installed upon them, as this option was always available. This naturally freed up the other special operations companies, 6 regular and 1 heavy weapons company, in addition to the 8th company being its headquarters company, to conduct their operations upon dismounting a safe distance away in order to maintain stealth and surprise until the last possible moment before striking their fatal blow. On the first map, during the opening of hostilities, roughly 80 miles inland at the outer limits of the PHL-03's range, were the first 2 out of 3 total firing batteries of the HIMARS Battalion deployed, leaving only the headquarters and service battery and 1 firing battery to pack up and escape, to relocate to another of multiple pre-prepared firing positions upon all 3 batteries having fired a full salvo before incoming completely wiped out the first 2 batteries. And this only even possible due to hearing shell impacts further to the south of Chinese howitzer shells, being the cacophony of which could be heard many miles away. Hostile aircraft also operating overhead could be heard and seen, and not the least of factors being already loaded and having decisive and quick-thinking leadership among its commander, executive officer, and battery captains, respectively, out of the battalion, making the choice to fire while they had the chance to, fearing the worst if they failed to act. No sooner had this occurred than did the impacts of 300mm rockets wipe out 1 battery, while Su-25s doing in the other, totally smashing a 1 kilometer by 1 mile area and 2 earthwork firing positions from the air, thus eliminating both batteries, including their respective headquarters platoons and their campsites and rocket supply dumps. This being one section of that ordeal right here. This symbolizes a portion of one of the batteries being destroyed by 300mm rockets. This is one of the firing batteries about to be finished off, as one of their earthwork protective firing positions has already been smashed by Su-25s dropping 1,000-pound munitions on top of it. As they are coming in, they're dropping follow-up munitions and strafing with their 30mm blasting tipped ammunition towards these rockets, these HIMARS systems right here. They're impacting into the earthworks, hitting two of the HIMARS, and eliminating them and some individual troops surrounding them, and a supply truck. And Chi-Com artillery is about to be called in on them as well. And there are 4 different loitering munitions, CH-901s, which the A variant of them has a distance of flight of 30 miles and can stay airborne for roughly over 60 minutes. And these can be fired either by a 48-tube truck, by headquarters units with dedicated personnel, and they can be either manually operated or AI operated. And these 4 were fired from individual tubes, as that's the other option of delivery. They can be carried individually, fired individually, and operated individually, as opposed to the 48-tubed truck launching system, or TEL-like launching system, along with a command vehicle with monitors in it. These can be launched and individually controlled from smaller monitors. These 4 being launched by MSS personnel, or fifth column bad actors that were subversive elements within the country to aid and abet the invasion, conduct spying, and other such intelligence activities as it related to their specialty of their class. Artillery had been called in on the encampment and supply tent. These forces are trying to bring rockets in to be loaded on these HIMARS systems, as these systems had been pre-trained on specific coordinates within Mexico. And these vehicles, these lighter trucks, had been destroyed by these CH-901s respectively. As any type of unit on these maps that is completely surrounded by the color of the attacking force means that they're destroyed. If they're only partially colored by the attacking color, that means they're just taking fire, such as these trucks trying to get out of the area and join this convoy of HIMARS vehicles and MRAPs and supply trucks. These trucks are trying to get off the road and join them as they head to an alternate firing point to relocate and escape the barrage coming in from rocket artillery, air attack, and these loitering munitions that appeared being fired from MSS agents deep in the country. All of this land that had been used for FOBs and for firing points had been leased from local ranchers and farmers. This being a local ranch right here, this being the ranch house, a shed, barns, a silo. One group of 3 rocket sections of the battery was being hit by the Su-25s when the last surviving firing battery and headquarters support battery were already packed up and fleeing off-road to set up and fire again upon reaching their next position. All of these firing positions, as well as those outposts of the 136th MP Battalion, were all on farming or ranch lands leased for their use by the Army. Although as such, made the families that ultimately owned the properties as unwitting targets, as their homes remained on these properties, and more often than not, ended up as collateral damage. As the 270mm rockets sailed towards Mexico from the original volley, the 18th Air Defense Artillery Brigade got to fire its first shots in combat, not against American aircraft, nearly all of which would be destroyed on the ground by this point, but rather against these 270mm rockets. A total of 108 fired in the first volley by all three firing batteries, prior to the destruction of 2 of the 3 total of said HIMARS batteries belonging to the battalion. Doing most of these rocket intercepts were the HQ-11 and HQ-6A battalions. There were one of each in the brigade, 1 battalion of each, with 2 other battalions comprised of HQ-2J systems, which were medium range but high altitude systems, and 2 battalions completely of truck-based 57mm cannons for close-in air defense artillery support, which, although the simplest of these ADA weapons listed, still had a high-altitude reach to it, potentially, although accuracy depended on how well trained each gunner and crew as a whole were. Both the HQ-6A and HQ-11 systems were missile-based systems, although the HQ-11 also possessed an LD-3000 close-in weapon system, essentially a high-speed Gatling gun which was radar-directed. In addition to the HQ-2J of the other battalions, an older medium-range high-altitude system was passed down to reserve forces. These extremely upgraded and effective systems were easy and fast to set up, fuel up, and prepare to fire, and highly portable, making them excellent for adding to the layered air defenses of the 16th Group Army as a whole. Although the HQ-11s and HQ-6As successfully destroyed 78 of the first 108 rockets fired, 30 did manage to get through, and of those that did, some actually produced casualties. Although some hit empty fields or Mexican buildings, thereby eliminating or wounding Mexican civilians, as the headquarters support company and last remaining firing battery sped off into the dark of the night, they were only to fire off one last volley of 36 rockets, seeing all but 10 of those intercepted. For a total of 40 making it through to cause, for a grand total of 40 making it through out of all rockets fired between both volleys to cause 150 Chi-Com KIAs in total and 380 WIAs as well. These KIA/WIA numbers being split between troops of the 16th Group Army still on the Mexican side of the river that hadn't as of yet crossed, and Also, on an infantry company from a battalion from one of the 15th Group Army subunits, as the 15th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th Group Armies were still preparing to cross behind the 16th Group Army, which was currently spearheading the invasion by clearing the McAllen, Texas area of American defending forces in order to simplify and streamline the advance further inland, as the Rio Grande was the only real barrier slowing down matters as it stood. As CCP logistical properties inland and Trojans capturing key cities serving as major transit hubs removed the only other two factors that could have slowed things down. This was because they wouldn't need to wait for supplies to catch up to them necessarily, and could go straight to them at the CCP properties. And the Trojans would ensure that roads through cities wouldn't be blocked, thus ensuring ease of travel that might otherwise could have held them up for what potentially could have been whole days had the defenders had the time to prepare these potentially lethal choke points with defenses of any real consequence. Hearing the artillery begin to crash around them and hearing the screams of 4 hostile aircraft overhead barreling towards their fortified campsites, the troops of the 136th MP Battalion spread out in a half dozen of these combat outposts had already begun to be silently engaged as the 16th Special Operations Battalion was among the very first forces to cross the Rio Grande, dropped off roughly 1 mile from their objectives, namely the westernmost 2 American combat outposts. These outposts covering roads running adjacent to the border, originally having been constructed to aid in cutting off the flow of people illegally moving north into the country in previous years. Now, however, these constituted an extremely thin first line of defenses to the west of McAllen, Texas itself. Armed quadrupedal robots with 12.7 millimeter machine guns and non-armed robots of the same type carrying mortar tubes, base plates, the mortars themselves, and extra boxes of small arms ammo, including 25 millimeter grenades for tubes beneath some of the QBZ-03 rifles carried by the troops within the Spec Ops Battalion, along with the personnel in their various companies, including the battalion's 1 heavy weapons company, part of which was here, responsible for the 82 millimeter mortars, controlling the robots, some of which were here, and elsewhere on the battlefield, as this is just one section of the battle itself, and FPV drones, which were manned by these FPV drone operators, which these were quadcopter drones that carried highly destructive explosives straight to their targets, taking out them vehicles from the top, typically, or groupings of troops as well. These constitute mortar blasts. These constitute an FPV drone. This is a grouping of troops in a foxhole, a large foxhole, like hosting typically a machine gun, like a large machine gun nest, hosting a squad of troops built around a machine gun, as in typical American infantry fashion. Even though these were MPs, they were used as combat troops in this case. All the X's are where additional Chi-Com artillery of different types would be called in. At the time of this subsection of the battle, this is where artillery was impacting. These symbolize artillery strikes impacting at the time of showing this cross-section of the battle. These are earthwork fortifications topped with concertina and razor wire around their fob. These constituted a fob. These were their tents. These are guard shacks with sandbags. These are guard towers with sandbags in them to protect those on guard duty, monitoring the area. This was a portable building, like a command building. Of course, there was room for a motor pool. These were all filled with gravel. This is a road. Here's another one. Here's a motor pool. Motor pool is in where they stored their units' vehicles. This was a two-company element area of FOBs, and there were more to the east. There's a group of MPs on patrol being attacked by air attack as this Su-25 comes in, drops a pair of 1,000-pound munitions, and fires KH-23 missiles, which are laser-guided missiles that are like short range. They have a roughly 7-mile range at the most. Fired them back here. Wherever there's a trail of smoke, that's where it came from. As it was swooping down, fired them and dropped its payload. You can see the arrows where they were headed. It's completely encircled with blue, so it means they were completely destroyed. Anytime you see an arrow completely encircled with the enemy color, it means they were completely gone, wiped out. So this group is gone. They were also attacked by Chinese CH-901 loitering munitions, armed with heat warheads, which means high explosive anti-tank warheads, as they can either be armed with heat warheads, HE warheads, which is just regular high explosive, and then there's also fragmentation, like HE frag warheads, which are mostly used against personnel concentrations. You know, these drones can be fitted with different munitions depending on the mission, depending on, you know, what's required as far as mission requirements are concerned and what type of targets they're after. These are the special operations operators and their squads moving tactically in their formations, where they begin at on this map. They're all in wedge formations, assaulting the different parts. See, they're attacking in a general L-type tactical movement, where all their fire can go two different ways. So they're firing from this way and up from this way. So this entire place is being hit from two different directions. Between all the small arms fire, it's being hit by mortars over a mile away on this hill. These are their robots that carry their mortars, their mortar tubes and base plates. These are the heavy weapons troops firing mortars, FPV drone operators with their equipment. And here's some additional troops guarding them. And the robots with the heavy machine guns, 12.7 millimeter, which is like 50 caliber machine guns, essentially. It's a 50 caliber sized round. They're completely spraying this place. These are like mobile fire support platforms for the troops. And when this initially started, snipers in these squads were engaging the troops in the guard tower with their silenced JS sniper rifles, which had threaded barrels with suppressors attached to them. They were taking out any type of sentries that they could find before this battle erupted, before the artillery started landing, before, you know, which is a terrain denial mission up here, and of course they hit some enemies before completely leveling their FOBs. Mortar support, FPV drone support, taking out all kinds of vehicles, loitering munitions, taking out troops and vehicles, artillery. I mean, it's air power, the whole 9 yards. These guys didn't even have a chance. This is exactly what would happen in such a scenario. No chance, just caught up in a kill box. An L-shaped kill box where fire is coming from this way, from the air, in the form of loitering munitions, FPV drones, air power, artillery, mortars. Non-armed robots of the same type, carrying mortar tubes, base plates, and the mortars themselves, and extra boxes of small arms ammo, including 25mm grenades for the tubes beneath some of the QBZ-03 rifles of the troops within the Spec Ops Battalion, along with the personnel and their various companies, including the battalion's one heavy weapons company responsible for the 82mm mortars, robots, and FPV drones, had since moved into place. The closest of the Special Operations troops being only 550 meters from where the snipers began to quietly eliminate the roving sentries and some in guard towers before the first shells and aerial-based munitions struck, causing mass chaos and complete disorganization amongst the American forces. In terms of their general response, these JS or Jiangxi 7.62 by 54mm threaded barrel customized bolt-action suppressed sniper rifles wielded by the battalion snipers had already dispatched some 30 different American sentries by the time of the full-scale attack on their FOBs. There were other FOBs besides just this one. This was just two different companies, as there were other FOBs manned by other companies of this 136th MP Battalion. By then, the Heavy Weapons Company was set up with its 2 mortar platoons, FPV drone, and robotics operators, adding to the overall lethality of the regular special operators within their 6 different companies, making short work of the defending forces. Not only the heavy artillery and airstrikes pummeling the combat outposts themselves, but mortars and FPV drones did as well, ensuring the destruction of all combat vehicles that weren't yet hit by the artillery or munitions delivered by the now circling Su-25s, which were ground attack aircraft. They specialized in that. All the while, the special operators tactically maneuvered with the aid of their armed combat robots, losing no one while dealing out devastating casualties on machine gun nests and any remaining survivors attempting to resist from behind the earthen berms and concertina wire fortifications of their now burning, rubble, and wreckage-strewn outposts, as all their vehicles and buildings and tents were now completely obliterated, with the remains tossed to and fro everywhere. On the depicted map, the one platoon of the regular company held back was utilized as a QRF force, or quick reaction force, being these troops right here, as they didn't move ahead. And it was held back unless, in case it was so needed. However, as the other 2 combat platoons of one company with mobile robotic fire support maneuvered into position, their fire was vectored in a large L shape, adding to the closing of what now became a large, several miles long kill box, now being shelled, mortared, missiled, and bombed out, along with the array of small arms and crew-served machine guns now peppering thoroughly the entire area. Upon defeating the 136th MP Brigade, one of the main American combat forces in the area was now removed. They as well as the 4th Battalion of the 133rd Field Artillery Regiment, had been the main priority of the 16th Group Army, with armed civilians, including a known militia in the region, and paramilitary elements of the American regime, were a bit lower on the list of priorities, but nonetheless also needed to be hastily dealt with to ensure that the follow-up occupation forces, consisting of 4 battalions of Chinese national militia troops, to be sent into the area once all 7 group armies had passed through, heading north and then east into the southeastern United States, would have the simple task in terms of their patrols of and policing the area. After this battle had concluded, the rest of the battle will be covered in the next video, which will be moving on to the 4th Armored Division and their activities clearing the right flank of the assault into the lower Rio Grande Valley / McAllen area, which will cover a large encounter in Brownsville before moving on to other parts of this battle.